In C-Log2, middle gray is 39.8 IRE, and if I expose with a gray card, my skin lands about here. Personally though, I don't like to use gray cards or light meters every time I expose a shot, so I'm gonna show you how I practically expose C-Log2 on the C70 with just the camera's built-in tools. So for the most part, I try to expose the C70 by using LUTS and the ND filters, and not touching any other camera settings if I can help it. So personally, this is where I start. I set the camera's ISO to the native, the shutter angle to 180, and the f-stop to whatever depth of field makes sense for the scene. That way I have the most highlight detail, I have correct motion blur, and I have my desired depth of field. Now the one setting we have that does not affect the image creatively, but just affects the amount of light hitting the sensor is the ND filter. As a rule of thumb, I always start with these camera settings, then I adjust my NDs, and if I really need tweaking between those two-stop ND settings, I'll make changes to my lighting, or if I need to, very slightly to my f-stop. The exposure tools. I don't use external monitors typically with the C70. Personally, I like controlling the focus with the LCD, and it's just easy to control everything with the LCD on the C70, so I'm using all of the built-in tools with the built-in LCD. First, false color. False color allows you to see 6 IRE regions overlaid onto a grayscale version of your image. Later on, I'll dig into why this really isn't a super helpful tool for exposing skin tones, but is still useful. Next, the waveform. The waveform is especially helpful on the C70 because you can enable a red box, which is called line and spot under the waveform settings. This lets you pinpoint a subject's skin and adjust your exposure to prioritize them. The waveform is actually a bit hard to see because of how small it is on the C70's LCD, but that's where the spot and line settings become essential. I wish you could enlarge the whole waveform, but unfortunately with the current firmware, that's not possible. I've heard people give different recommendations for where skin tones should lie in C-Log2. What we do know is that middle gray is 39.8 IRE. So in this test here, I exposed for middle gray, and you can see it's just under 40, which is where it should be, and my skin landed between 40 and 50 IRE. So that's a good range for quote-unquote proper exposure. As I understand it though, it's really much more of a subjective, creative decision than a strictly scientific one. I love camera tests, so let's do one. In the first edit of this video, I had a 5-minute section where I incrementally raised the exposure on my skin and showed you how everything looked along the way. I decided not to waste your time. Here's a quick overview. My skin looks best, I think, personally, between 40 and 55 IRE. Now that's a pretty wide range. I'd say 45 is probably my favorite, but of course this will change with your subject's complexion and your personal creative preferences. So the reason why earlier I said false color isn't super great on this camera for nailing skin tones is because of this. Green does not go directly into pink. It goes into gray first, and then into pink, and then it goes into gray again. There's a lot of guessing if something is brighter than pink or darker than green. It would be much more helpful if I could adjust inside the camera what IRE values are what color and how big those ranges are. But because it's just little slivers of pink and little slivers of green with the same color in between and above and below, I don't find it super helpful unless I'm using a gray card, which I don't actually ever do. However, I use it constantly to make sure I'm preserving my highlights. And it's pretty hard to see on that tiny waveform if the line is flattening like it is there and clipping, or just close to clipping. So that's where I find toggling on the false color to be extremely helpful to just see, is there any red? And if there is, do I want to recover it? Lastly, zebras. Until making this video, I actually never enabled zebras on this camera even once. But when looking at this topic from all angles, I realized it's actually probably the easiest way to check your exposure when you're prioritizing skin tones. I always associated zebras with checking for blown out highlights, and you can do that, but they're super powerful for setting a plus or minus 5 IRE range that lets you really dial in your exposure for someone's skin. So I set a custom button to be zebras at 45 IRE plus or minus 5. And now I can click it to dial in a person's face without having to line up that red box or decipher the waveform. It's pretty sweet. Let's see it in practice with this sample talking head shot. All right, here we are in my office next to a blown out window. We are of course starting with the base camera settings of 180-degree shutter, 800 ISO, and whatever f-stop makes sense for the scene. So what we're gonna change is lights and ND filters. Let's start with ND because everything is too hot. Let's go to 4. Looks much better, but the sky is still blown out, so let's go to 6. Let's check with false color if the sky is blown out. Still is a tiny bit, so let's go to 8 stops. Now everything is saved. And I am hyper underexposed. So let's turn on a light. So this is a fairly contrasty scene. I could center the light to be flatter, but I'm gonna keep this fairly contrasty, and let's expose for the brighter part of my skin. So I will do that by checking these zebras. And what do you know, it's perfect. My face is zebraed. Now, just to make sure, let's rock back and forth on the aperture, and we can see that right there at 1.1, we're starting to get blown outness above the zebras. And if we go down to 2.0, most of my face now is below the zebra. Only the very brightest part of my cheek is there. So let's go back to 1.4, 1.2, let's go to 1.4, and let's click off zebras. And we have an exposed shot. There we go. Skies, check. Skin, check. I'm gonna use this all the time. I can't believe I didn't even check my waveform. Now that I know how easy this zebra method is, it's gonna be my primary tool from now on. I hope you learned something. I know I did. Lastly, I have 2 parting tips. First, up your camera's luminance value, but do not touch the LCD's brightness settings. The brightness will wash out your image, but luminance will just make everything easier to see, especially outside. And it will drain your battery a little bit more, but the battery life on this camera is so good anyway that I think it's really worth it, unless you're in a serious pinch to preserve power. And lastly, if you enable the built-in LUT on the camera, you should just be fine, judging by eye. The LCD on this camera is so good, despite its questionable build quality, it's very reliable. I've used a lot of cameras where you can't really trust what you're seeing on the LCD is actually what you're capturing, but after using this camera for the better part of a year, I think you can.